I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to another special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. This is the 10th episode of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, reading the stories in order. So if you're reading along with us, just know that your next story up will be Only a Mother by Judith Merrill, which I'm very excited to talk about next month. But for this month, we're talking about Murray Leinster. I think Brian and I were talking about that before we recorded, and his classic 1945 story, First Contact. So I have two special guests joining me, first time on the podcast, but we have talked science fiction together before in the real world. We were the three members of a panel at the Speculative Fiction Across Media Conference in Los Angeles. And so we can, I was presenting my DC Fontana paper, and Stephen was talking about Joanna Russ, and Brian was talking about all kinds of different women science fiction authors who wrote under male sounding names. So let me start with Brian, I'll start with Stephen. Stephen is a retired Wayne State professor, philosopher, and cultural critic. His areas of interest included film theory, science fiction, capitalism, and how all these things cross and connect.
And also slime molds.
And slime molds. And he is the author of one of his most well-known books is the 1997 book Doom Patrols, which is a theoretical look at postmodernism, right? And then we also have more recently The Universe of Things and many, many other books. Stephen, welcome to the Postcards from a Dying World.
I should mention my most recent book about science fiction, which is called Fluid Futures, which came out this past year.
Oh, awesome. I'm going to put that on my list immediately. And Brian Attebery is a writer and emeritus professor of English and philosophy at Idaho State University. He is the author of Fantasy Tradition in American Literature from Irving to Le Guin. And I believe your most recent is How It Works, but you've worked with Le Guin on the Norton Book of Science Fiction and helped edit the Hainish Cycle series with Le Guin. Brian, welcome to the podcast. Did I get your most recent work right?
It's Fantasy How It Works.
Fantasy How It Works, yeah.
And I'll also mention, because I do science fiction as well as fantasy, a book called Decoding Gender in Science Fiction.
Right, which is already on my list. So and so we were a block presenting papers in Los Angeles, and so I'm really excited to kind of reteam this group to talk about Murray Leinster and the 1945 story First Contact. Me personally, most of the information that I got about Murray Leinster, I got from reading Seekers of Tomorrow by Sam Moskowitz, which is a fantastic collection of short biographies of science fiction writers, and that was very helpful. Most of the information was also on Wikipedia. It's out there. But so let's get into the history of this guy and who he is. But before I get into that, starting with Brian, what's your history with reading this author?
Oh, well, like many, I grew up reading these anthologies, and he was a standby,
Mhm.
not only in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, but I think the Groff Conklin and several of the other sort of classic anthologies. And then when I was working on the gender and science fiction book, I went back and did a project of reading, I think, every science fiction magazine published in a given year. And I went back a little earlier, 1937. So I was reading these in a collection from cover to cover and thinking about how they worked, not as excerpted in the anthologies, but in their original place of publication. And so he was one of those that you would come across. He was very prolific
Mhm.
under both his own name. If he had already published, if he'd already published a Murray Leinster story in a particular magazine, then he would use his real name of Will F. Jenkins or some other pen name.
Right. And he had published over 1,000 short stories, close to half of another grand in his lifetime over various magazines. 1,500 stories. That's a lot. Um, Stephen, what's your history with reading Murray here?
Well, I started reading science fiction seriously probably when I was around 9 years old or so. And again, like Brian, I read a number of anthologies of various authors who, from the golden age. And a story by Leinster called The Eternal Now really stuck in my head for years and years and years. And I read other stuff of his along the way, but I spent like 50 years obsessed with this story, which I finally wrote a little bit about, like a page or two in the course of my most recent book. But
Awesome.
so I was aware of him mostly because I was totally obsessed with this one story, which is not first kind of, but an equally interesting story.
Yeah, well, feel free later on to get into what that story is about too, because I think one of the things I is certainly the mission of this podcast, or one of the things that I'm trying to do is highlight these authors and make sure that they never become lost, that we continue to talk about them. And Murray Leinster had a huge impact. For one thing, he was publishing science fiction before the genre actually had a name, and that is one of the important things about his influence. He was a high school dropout, and he was 2 months short of his 20th birthday when he sold his first story, which was called The Foreigner, which appeared in the May 1916 issue of H.L. Mencken's literary magazine, The Smart Set. I've never heard of it before, but I don't know if either of you have heard of this magazine, but I have not. But he was publishing, so 1916, he was doing fantastic stories, and we know that that's a full decade before the genre is named scientific fiction. And but probably his standout, like here I am, a fantasist, a science fiction writer, was in Argosy. Is that how it's pronounced? Argosy? In 1919, he published a story called The Runaway Skyscraper, which was about a time traveling building, if I recall. I read it, but I read it several years ago. And that appeared in the February 22nd, 1919 issue of Argosy. And that magazine was huge and foundational for many early science fiction writers, because that was a market for fantasy stories as early as the 19 teens, I believe. But it may have even, was it the end of the 18th century, or was it the 19 teens when Argosy started? I'm not entirely certain of that. But he published in all the pulps. He published Westerns, he published detective stories, he published in Weird Tales. He was all over the case. He did romance stories in women's romance magazine. So he did everything. And another reason why Runaway Skyscraper is an important story, it was also republished in the June 1926 issue of Amazing Stories, which is the first issue of Amazing Stories. And which I'm excited to be a part of that tradition as a columnist at Amazing Stories. And it's just one of those cool things that, he was a part of the official genre from the beginning. The first issue of Astounding also had a Murray Leinster story called Tanks. So he was in the first issue of both Amazing and Astounding, which is
amazing and astounding.
Amazing and Astounding. That's right. And he was one of the first writers to write about parallel universes. A lot of concepts, Leinster was the first to get to them. 4 years before Williamson did Legion of Time, he did Sideways in Time, which was one of the first like kind of time travel parallel universe stories, and that was in the June 1934 issue of Astounding. And he also was one of the first to write about personal computers in everyone's homes with, I believe it's called A Logic Called Joe was the name of that story. Yeah. And that was after First Contact. I think that was a year after First Contact. But he also did other things, like he invented a special effects system, the front projection system, where and I don't know where he was in the situation where he was doing that, but apparently he created a special effects system, which is quite a different thing. Do you guys have any commentary or anything you want to say about like his impact in this era? Because I will move on to my argument after that of why he's the most important, one of the most important writers of the 20th century. But Brian, do you have anything on?
I believe he was also an inventor and had something to do with the invention of front projection used in movies as a special effect.
Yeah, and so I don't know if he just liked inventing things, but and his real name was it Will Jenkins or yeah, Will Jenkins was his real name. And he very, very important to the lots of scientific ideas. For somebody who dropped out of high school, he certainly tried to engage with like hard science in a lot of these stories too, for the time, right?
Do we know how he got this information? Did he read scientific journals and things like that?
Yeah, I can't find anything that says that, but I can say as a dickhead that the whole reason why PKD as a young kid got Stirring Science Stories the first time was he was looking for the Journal of Science. And I think a lot of these young science fiction fans and these kids who were like angling towards actually writing this stuff felt like they needed to read those scientific journals if they were going to write in the field, and but so I don't know where his science training and background where it came to, but he did. I don't know how you guys feel, but I feel like he writes the science pretty good for the time. So
no, he does, but I mean, even when he has like the story, which maybe we'll talk about later, which I obsessed me for years, it's totally bogus from a scientific point of view, but it's based on an actual knowledge of relativistic physics, which not everybody had at the time or even now. So it's even when it's bogus ideas, they're based on actual science.
Yeah. Well, okay. So now I'm going to hit you with my argument with Murray Leinster. So what would we argue that Stephen King is one of the top selling authors in the history of literature? I think we would argue that Stephen King has sold probably more books than, many, many, many human beings, but we would not have Stephen King, the writer, without Murray Leinster, because, and I'm reading from Stephen King on writing. This is Stephen King. When I was in the 8th grade, I happened upon a paperback by Murray Leinster, a science fiction pulp writer who did most of his work during the 40s and 50s. I think he needed to go back a little bit further, but uh, when magazines like Amazing Stories paid a penny a word. I had read other books by Mr. Leinster, enough to know the quality of his writing was uneven. This particular tale, which was about mining in the asteroid belt, and I think it's the Whaling Asteroid, is the book that he was talking about, was one of his less successful efforts. Only that's too kind. It was terrible. Actually, a story populated by paper thin characters and driven by outlandish plot developments. Worst of all, it seemed to me at the time, Leinster had fallen in love with the word zestful. Characters watched the approach of ore-bearing asteroids with zestful smiles and zestful anticipation. Near the end of the book, the hero swept the large-breasted blonde heroine into a zestful embrace. For me, it was the literary equivalent of smallpox vaccination. I have never, so far as I know, used the word zestful in a story. God willing, I never will. Asteroid Miners, which wasn't the title, but it's close enough, was an important book in my life as a reader. Almost anyone can remember losing his or her virginity, and most writers can remember the first book he or she put down thinking, I can do better than this. Hell, I'm doing better than this. What could be more encouraging to the struggling writer than to realize his or her work is unquestionably better than someone who got paid for his or her stuff? Now, that's pretty insulting, I know. But if Murray Leinster wrote the story that Stephen King said, hey, I can do this, could we argue that Murray Leinster's the Wielding Asteroid, I think that's what it was called, is a very important book because it inspired Stephen King to become a writer. I don't know. But I think it. Now he did say it was uneven. He did say that some of his stories were good, and I've seen also where people have asked him about this, and he did say like, "Oh no, he wrote great stuff. It's just that particular one I did not think was great." Now, but it's kind of a mean way to say that he had a huge impact, but I do think that it's part of the Murray Leinster story now. It has to be. I don't know what you guys think about that. Brian, had you ever heard of Stephen King commenting on this?
I wasn't aware of that, but I did notice some really clunky uses of language in this story,
Yeah.
Which is not the point. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think probably Stephen King would acknowledge this, that something else is going on. And I'd like, before we finish, I want to talk about, what kind of text is this? Because I don't think reading it as a sort of self-contained work of art is the right thing to do.
Sure.
But I'll
Yeah.
leave that.
Yeah, and we'll get there. We're almost to the story. So, Stephen, what do you think about this quote?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the way it impresses me or interests me that Leinster wrote not just science fiction, but he wrote like every genre. It's sort of
Right.
like you could say, I mean, the unkind way to say it, which I'm sure Stephen King would agree with, is that Leinster was a hack, but he actually, allows you to have a more positive valorization of what it means to be a hack, because it means that he was a jack of all trades who could basically do anything, and he turned his mind to. I mean, it's interesting also. I mean, that's not the same thing as people who write science fiction, let's say, because they're obsessed with the themes of science fiction. I don't know enough about Leinster to know what he was obsessed with, but if you could write and sell a science fiction story, do it. If it was a Western, he could do it. If it was a detective story, he could do it. It's sort of like he has this very professionalized attitude towards writing, which is sometimes rightly criticized compared to people who have an ambitious and deep vision of things. But it's something which I think is admirable in itself. That he doesn't seem like the guy who ever had problems with writing blocks or I can't figure this out. I mean, he just like comes up with these ideas one after another and almost spouts them out and stuff like that. And there's something kind of wonderful about that.
Right. Well, and far be it from Stephen King to have written so much that he does not have a whole, some crap in his canon, right? I think he would. I mean, I love a lot of Stephen King, but he also wrote Under the Dome, which I found to be unreadable, towards the end, and that's partially because, as much as I love Uncle Steve, he's written a lot. And when you write that much, and especially when you have editors who are afraid of you and will not tell you no, you end up with stuff that has a zestful in it a bunch. I don't know, but I think Mary Leinster was probably an author who was so popular at the time that a lot of magazines were probably going to take anything that he was writing. And so I'm sure some things were of higher quality and than others. That happens to a writer. So but
I mean, the analogy I make is sort of like, well, two filmmakers who are not usually put together, but say Woody Allen and Clint Eastwood. They're both in their 90s. They've both been making a film a year for like 30 or 40 years. And
right.
some of them are great, some of them are terrible, some of them, many are in between, but they just turn them out. And as I said, there's something admirable about that kind of work ethic as a creator.
Yeah. Yeah. And also I think for some of us, like, PKD wrote a lot. And I actually think that there's value in some of the lesser works that some people don't like. I have a lot of strong feelings about, for example, the world Jones made, and a lot of people do not, as a work of PKD, and that's fine. I think sometimes it's good to have that level of production. And I agree with you, Stephen, and like even and that's why it's kind of sad, of all the movies that Clint Eastwood ends on Juror Number 2, which was a fine movie. It was fine, right? But
I haven't seen it yet, but it's kind of depressing the way that they just buried it and didn't promote it.
Right. Exactly.
Because of his
Yeah.
track record.
Exactly. And especially the studio Warner Brothers that he worked at for.
Yeah.
I also want to speak a little bit up for Leinster, and that is to say that when you read the whole run of things from his era, he's well above the median.
Absolutely.
He's not up there with C.L. Moore or Stanley Weinbaum, who really stand out as doing something beyond what most of the others are doing. But he's also not one of those that you go, oh, not another story by so and so, because there were a number of those that filled the magazines.
Absolutely. All right. So this is the point in the episode where, if you're listening to the audio, I'm going to apologize because I'm going to share screen and we're going to look at the actual issue of Astounding. So if you are listening in audio and you want to see what it looks like, the YouTube video will be available, and you can see us roll our eyes or smile at certain things. But right now we're going to look at this issue of Astounding. So First Contact was the cover story in this issue of Astounding. Now, what was going on in the world on May 1945? It's kind of an important month in the world. Whenever I do these, I always have to look up what was happening in the world at the time. I didn't need to do that in May 1945, partially because I wrote a novel that takes place during this time. My novel, The Last Night to Kill Nazis, of course, is the night before the surrender of the Nazis, which happened in May 7th, 1945. And this was obviously the end of the war. The Russians make it to Berlin and all that. It's a very fascinating time for this particular issue, partially because of some of the commentary by John W. Campbell. We get the wonderful ads. Infectious dandruff labels you objectionable. Of course, now this is where Alec Neville Ali always wants me to remind everyone that Campbell had no control over the ads. That Street and Smith put these ads in there. Keep your Red Cross at his side. So, okay, this is the issue. So one thing I want to comment on is if you look at this issue, because it's the month that the Nazis surrender, this whole essay at the beginning by John W. Campbell about how we have to admit that the Nazis made the rockets first. And it's basically talking about how interesting it is that no matter like how bad the Nazis were, they started the rocket age. It's a really weird and interesting essay to be in this particular issue of the magazine. And so I found that very curious thing about it. Now, Brian, you sent the link for this magazine, so you definitely were looking through this issue.
Yeah.
And we can comment about, there's obviously an A.E. von Vogt story novelette in here as well. And I read the Frank Bellenkamp long story, but I did not read the A.E. von Vogt one. Starting with Brian, and then we'll get Stephen's point of view. What do you think about when you look at this table of contents for this particular issue?
Well, it's fairly, I mean, you would see some sort of rearrangement of these same figures in almost any issue around this time. I believe that Van Vogt story was the beginning of what became a novel, and I don't remember which one as a fix-up of shorter works put together. I did read ahead a couple of issues to the next Brass Tacks, which is their reader letters column. And there wasn't one in the following issue after this or the one after that, but a couple later. And the readers were responding mostly to the Van Vogt story. I didn't see anything specifically about the Leinster story.
Yeah, I looked for that too. And it's funny that I didn't realize that the brass tacks were not in every issue, but that happened also. It must have been something during the wartime, because that happened with Arena as well. When I looked forward for Arena, it was hard to find commentary on it.
Mm-hmm. I will say, there's something about reading these stories in their magazine context that is illuminating for me. And that is, instead of seeing them sort of extracted and put together into an anthology, which is kind of like displaying them in a museum with, curated, this is where they functioned originally. And they are part of a kind of continuum of meaning. And even though, as you say, Campbell didn't choose the ads are part of that meaning. And so in this one, there's war bonds. I think maybe a couple of different ads for war bonds. When it wasn't wartime, you would get the bodybuilding ads, or the take a course in radio technology and get a good job. So you really get a sense not only of the audience, but also of the kind of circumstances under which these things were read. And the illustrations are part of that. The letters columns are part of that. The little blurbs put in at the heads of stories by the editor. And the stories talk to each other. And that's something I want to get to when we come to the story itself, is that it was part of a dialogue that had been going on for quite a while. And one of the significances of it is that it named that dialogue as First Contact fiction.
Yep, absolutely. It started a subgenre, for sure. And one of the things that's interesting too is that when you look at the brass tacks, and I agree with you, there was plenty of commentary about the Von Vogt one that seemed to be spurring more conversation. But Campbell obviously thought that First Contact was the was the story of this issue, and he put it on the cover, right? Um, it could be because of his popularity as well, but Von Vogt was popular as well. This was 1 year before he started doing Null A, right? So they started doing Null A in the next year in the in Astounding. So the one story that I read, The Trap, Frank Long, Bellenkamp Long, is an acolyte of Lovecraft, wrote a lot of Lovecraftian fiction. And that story is kind of a weird alien story. Um, Very short, but I really like that story as well. And I was meaning to read the Von Vogt, but I didn't get to it quite in time. Stephen, is there anything looking at the table of contents that comes to your mind that
Things coming, well, I mean, I have not done research in these original issues, but looking at the table of contents, I noticed V2 rocket cargo ship by Willie Ley, Ley. Willie Ley, I don't know much about him, but when I was a kid, I had a lot of his books and stuff. He was a science popularizer. And so here there's an article about the V2 rocket at the time when the war is finally ending.
yeah,
So that interesting.
Yeah, and I
absolutely.
think if you put
thinking
that
about, I mean,
together, putting that together with what the readers were writing in and responding to, they cared about the science in these stories. And if
yeah.
you got your orbits wrong, they would take you to task. Or if you said something about isotopes that was not accurate to the science, they would say, no, this isn't the way it works, it's this. So again, it suggests that there's something else going on in the text than we might be aware of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Well, again, just
and
see.
that the whole interesting thing about that V2 article, and then of course this introduction that Campbell did, is that when they sent this off to the printer, it was pretty obvious that Hitler was losing, but they had not surrendered yet. So, but I would say probably when Campbell's sending this to the printer, I think they had a pretty good idea that, the Russians were advancing already at that point. So, um, uh, it is a curious timing for all that.
It also anticipates what happens later, since, of course, well, nobody knew this at this time, but that the U.S. got all the Nazi rocket scientists like Werner von Braun to come to the U.S. and basically start the U.S. space program a decade or so later.
Absolutely. Yep. All right, so let's get into the story. The reason for the season, as it were. This is the first illustration for First Contact, and of course, we always want to read the little subtext that kind of cues the reader into what they're going to be reading. An expedition from Earth had gone to investigate the Crab Nebula, and on the expedition from somewhere, someone expedition from somewhere was already there. Now, what is a spaceship skip to do? A spaceship to oh, I'm sorry. The sunlight is bearing down on my screen really badly right now. Under such circumstances, lead the possible deadly aliens home, question mark, to destroy them, question mark. What can he do?
I suspect what is the spaceship skipped is a misprint for spacecraft skipper.
Yeah, right. So I like this illustration. I like the kind of feeling that it gives. It's the pole position story. It's the first story you're reading. So if you're in 1945 and you're a subscriber to Astounding, or if you pick this up on the newsstand, this is the first story you're reading. Let me try to give some details on the story, and then we'll get into talking about it. So the spaceship in it is called the Lavanaban. I think that's how it's pronounced. Lavanaban. My dyslexia is really comes home on some of these. Approaching the Crab Nebula, and it detects another ship with its radar. The two ships' radars are affecting each other. That was an interesting detail. And the name of the ship, the Lavanabon, the only thing I could find that it was named after is a town in South Wales. That appears to be what and I like the idea that there's a ship out there named after a town in South Wales, because that gives me the idea that there's a lot of ships out there. It's not just like, the Titan or the Enterprise, right? It's like there's a ship out there named after this little town in Wales. Although that's not explained in the story, I admit I had to Google that. There's pretty good science for the time, and yet there is a space phone in the story, which is something that made me laugh. And so our main character is Tommy Dort. He names one of the aliens Buck, which I think is really funny. This made me think of course, Project Hail Mary, the recent novel by Andy Weir, like this whole communication thing. And I saw a lot of Project Hail Mary kind of in these parts of the story. I liked two things that I really liked about this story was the fact that they set up teams, one for defeat and victory on the ship. I liked that a lot. And I really liked the atomic powered suits. And I like the fact also that they did not expect to have any reason for weapons. Is a really interesting element of this story. Let me see if there's any other illustrations before we start the discussion. There's that one. And then I always like, this is a good one here too. And then I believe one more here. And that's it. Okay, so I can stop share. If you guys want to look at anything else in the magazine, let me know. I can bring it back up. First Contact won the Retro Hugo Award for Best Novelette in 1996. It was adapted into radio plays. We'll come back to that, but let's talk about the story now as it appeared in the magazine. Rereading this.
I have a question right at the beginning, which is, did Leinster invent the phrase first contact? Because I was looking on some of his heirs tried to sue somebody else for using the phrase first contact, except the court ruled that since it was now such a common phrase, it couldn't be copyrighted. But that suggested maybe nobody had used the phrase first contact before this.
I don't believe anyone had. It certainly didn't have the cachet of having it be the title. So yes, they tried to sue Star Trek for Star Trek First Contact. I did send an email to Brandon Braga, the co-writer of that, to see if he wanted to comment on that, as Brandon and I are friendly, but I did not get a reply. I probably get a reply here soon, but just wondering what he thought of that lawsuit. But yeah, I think he invented it. I don't know what I think
he certainly popularized it. I mean, a lot of these phrases you'll find somebody put those words together at some time before, but not with the same significance and the kind of coherence that you get when it's the title of a story. That's also pretty important.
Absolutely. And when we talk about the adaptations, I think we'll get more into that a little bit. But rereading this story, when was the first time you read this story, starting with Brian?
Well, I read through the whole Science Fiction Hall of Fame many years ago. I barely remembered it. So when I picked it up to reread it this time, I went, oh, this is the story, huh? Because I had put it together with a bunch of other similar stories, including Arena, which is like immediately precedes it in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame and is kind of an alternate version of the same scenario.
Right. Stephen, did you remember when you first
Not
read
really.
it,
As
or?
I said, when I was like a teenager, I was obsessed with this one Leinster story, Eternal Now. So I know I read other Leinster stories just curiosity, who's this guy, but I didn't remember it. Eternal Now was one I remembered.
Okay, so starting with you, Stephen, what was your first feeling on rereading this and reading this today?
Well, again, I found it interesting that it had this scenario. It's sort of like, I mean, I don't know if he invented the scenario, and again, like if he invented the term first contact, but the fact is that this is now a very familiar scenario in science fiction of all sorts, but you get the impression of it's being fresh when he writes it, and I don't know. There's something about there's something about his clunky style, which is, I mean, as much endearing as it's bad. I mean, I don't know. You also, I couldn't help notice you have this all-male crew, but at the end, it turns out the other aliens are also an all-male crew, and the last line, the punchline at the very end of the story refers to that. And so it's this kind of, pre-feminist kind of thing where they don't even imagine, that you'd have anything other than this gender division of labor. But I mean, that's sort of, again, I read back to, oh yeah, 1945, there was probably a lot of that stuff, So I don't know. I found it charming. I mean, and I thought it sounded like it was a fresh take on something which you could no longer write freshly today.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
Brian.
it surprised me that the whole point of the story is how not to have a war.
Mhm.
And I put it together in my mind with H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, or Heinlein, the
Starship Troopers.
Starship Troopers.
Right.
That's kind of the dominant version of how the scenario ends up. Is we lose or we win, and it's an all or nothing thing. Even Arena has that, Frederick Brown's story, but this one says no. We need to figure out a way to avoid it. It's a classic problem slash solution structure, which is kind of the most common format for short fiction in this era in the magazines. Um, Basically, when I was looking at it, I thought, what kind of a story is this? It doesn't really have any characters. There's a named protagonist, but he has no personality.
Very
There,
little, yes.
Tommy Dort. There's the skipper, and then there's the alien who's called Buck. They're all interchangeable. You could switch them around easily. So if it doesn't have characters and it uh, spends a lot of time talking about things like how to maneuver through a nebula, um, what is it? It's a different kind of thing than what we usually think of as a literary uh, fiction. Um, and how do we read it now, especially? I was looking for things that mattered in the story and that might have mattered to those brass tacks letter writers. Um, and I think that the place matters a lot. Um, Space in general, the nebula as a specific kind of environment that has to be dealt with certain ways, and the ships, both ships, are spaces, each of which has its own properties that have to be comprehended and dealt with in a way that's going to lead to whatever ending you want. That's kind of more important than what the characters are all about. Um, it reminds me of something Joanna Russ came up with in an essay. I think it was in Science Fiction Studies way back. That in science fiction, the idea is the hero. That you care more about the fate of the idea. Will we break through into some sort of conceptual uh, new understanding? And that's more important than whoever these people are that are enacting it.
Right. Well, what I thought was really neat about the story is what you said, that this was written in a time of very intense warfare in the world, right? and that this whole story is basically about these two ships like trying to figure out like how do we not end up in conflict, and even that kind of weird twist that they switch ships, which, you know,
Hmm.
I don't know necessarily is the best ending. And it's funny because the radio plays, they did different endings, right? And
Hmm.
and but the I do think the whole aspect of the that this is about not creating conflict is one of the charming things about the story, and one of the things that makes it kind of like hold up as being like a neat thing. And you know, why do we read old science fiction? Well, I think one of the best reasons to read old science fiction is the idea that we can learn about the times in which they were written and get a view of how people in 1945 were thinking about the far future and thinking about these ideas. And I find this one to be fascinating, to you know, kind of, you know, think through what Murray Leinster Jenkins was doing when he sat at the typewriter and was like, okay, I'm going to write this story. And I had the, you know, I have a feeling that he was trying to write something that wasn't xenophobic, like all aliens are out to kill us type of story. I think
You know,
that's what he said.
I felt it kind of ahead of its time in that I would have expected a story like this to make much more sense in, say, 1950 than 1945, because it's almost as if he's reflecting on the Cold War, which obviously hadn't happened yet because the US and the Soviet Union were both allied against the Nazis. So
Yeah.
it's like, if it had been written in 1950, I would say, yeah, this is a kind of coded thing about the Cold War, and he's kind of a liberal who doesn't want to, you know, militantly destroy the enemy and things like that. But so it's kind of surprised me that it came out in 45.
Yeah. I had the thought while I was reading this too, and my screenwriter brain kind of just started like going to like, you could make a pretty low budget, very tense
Mhm.
adaptation of this if you know, developed the characters on and developed the alien species in an interesting way. Like you could do that and it would still hold up the story. You could make a pretty faithful adaptation of this, I think. And I think that I think you're right, Stephen, that it is really ahead of the Cold War. It is interesting, you know.
Because that would
Um,
seem to be, yeah, that would really seem to be the context that made most sense in, but it obviously didn't before that. So I don't know.
right. Well, and I'm thinking a lot about PKD's Cold War stuff because I'm teaching second variety later this week, and and it is fascinating that this was pre-Cold War, um, in that regard. Um, so as far as like the whole the lack of weapons on the ship, it's partially he's kind of implying that they're just never expecting to run into anything in like deep cold space. I thought that was a neat thing.
Mhm.
The kind of trick of like taking the atomic powered suits over to the other ship is a neat strategy. There's some kind of fun things going on with that. There's the creation of the universal translator that they mathematically translate. So a lot of people also credit this story for creating the universal translator in sci-fi, which is, you
Mhm.
know, fascinating. But Stephen, maybe this is a good time for you to tell us about this other story of your that you were obsessed with by Leinster.
It was, it came out in, I don't remember what magazine it came. Its date is 1944, so just a year before this, while the World War II was. It's a story called The Eternal Now,
Mhm.
and it's about a device which the basic the basic idea behind it is if we know from Einstein that travel at close to light speeds compresses time so that you fly to Alpha Centauri and come back, and it's 10 years later on Earth, but it's only 3 months later for the astronauts. You have the opposite of this. There's a device which pulls people into an infra world where a whole decade would maybe only equal like 2 seconds worth of time in the real world. And the the hero is pulled into this world by the evil scientist who has stolen his invention and is using it for nefarious purposes, and he has to and he has to figure out how to defeat the guy and get back to ordinary time. It turns out that the evil scientist knows how to drag things into this infraworld, but he doesn't know how to get things back out into the real world. So, but I mean, and the scientist, of course, is just being introduced to a woman, and they're shaking hands, so they're dragged into the infraworld together. So, of course, they become intimate, and at the end, when they come back to the real world, they get married. But, and that's
where did you find this story? Where did you?
In some, I wish I couldn't find. In some, I read a lot of. Okay, I mean, my history of science fiction is that I had already read some stuff like Tom Swift stories, but my uncle Morris, who was a French professor, but who was also a science fiction fan, gave me Doc Smith to read when I was 9 years old. And I read this and devoured it. It was fascinating. I read the other Doc Smith novels in the Lensman series. And then, I date my being a science fiction fan from, 61 years ago when I was 9 years old. So I had, when I was like 12 or 13, just an anthology of different science fiction stories. And I haven't been able to find out what the anthology was, but it was a hardcover anthology of science fiction stories by different writers, and usually a large percentage of it were really memorable stuff. So that's where I found The Eternal Now, I'm pretty sure. I've never been able to reconstruct. I've looked online, but somehow when they list different publication stories, but somehow I've never been able to say, oh, that must be the volume which it was in. But anyway, so it's all there in this infraworld. Time passes like you can go for a year and it'll only be a second in the real world. If you take things in, and there's a lot of stuff about that, you take things into there's something about how they're walking across the Hudson River because it's frozen. It doesn't move at this intense time scale. So it's like they could they're hungry and they find a stove with some cooking on. So they they pull the stove into the infra world. And then they remark on how well the cook who's doing cooking stuff in the stove is just looking away. When he looks back a second later, the stove will have decayed because it'll be like 500 years old or something like that, and will have decayed by entropy just by that time. And so there are all kinds of weird, interesting observations about that. I mean, they have to fight the bad guy who stole a weapon, stole the thing. The bad guy didn't. Fucked up because he didn't figure out how to do the inverse to get back to the ordinary time. Oh no, I'm getting a call, which I'll try to just ignore.
Hey, I usually have dogs interrupting, so
yeah.
But well, no, that sounds like a fascinating story.
So it's a fascinating idea, which I mean, it's scientifically always not true that you'd have this kind of time compression instead of dilation. But it's so it's bogus, but it's very carefully worked out in terms of actual science and how he explains it and things like that. And the plot is not that interesting, but again, it's like with First Contact, it's the whole concept is quite fascinating, and that's probably why I remember the story for so many years.
Well, it's clear Leinster had a knack for ideas and concepts.
For playing off actual scientific ideas.
Right. And so it's funny because he wrote in all these other genres, but I think he had a knack for science fiction because he came up with these weird ideas. And I wonder how, what did he write for money and what did he write because he was passionate about
It's unclear that he wrote anything except for money, but
yeah.
And I haven't read his other genres, so I have no idea how good they are.
Yeah, it has made me interested to see are there collections of Leinster westerns? And every once in a while that happens. Like I've read Matheson westerns, right, and they're pretty good. The one with the blind gunfighter by Matheson is quite incredible. And then he did do a horror western called Shadows of the Sun, which is very, very good. So, I mean, sometimes these other genres that, one of the things I noticed, especially like when I was doing the DC Fontana research, is that when these science fiction writers would write westerns for other shows, they would try to come up with interesting concepts for they have gee whiz ideas for those times that they got to go to Westerns as much as they can. They pushed it as much as they could.
Yeah.
And a lot of that became writing political stories in the Western world. But on that note, I don't know if either of you got a chance to listen to any of the radio dramas.
No.
At least two of them are just the same, just reproduced. So the X-1 and Dimension X were both 1951 and then later in the 50s NBC radio serials. So the X-1 has all the same performances, but the sound effects are much better and dialed up, and the recordings are cleaned up. So if you're going to listen to a radio play, I suggest the X-1, which was a great radio serial. Also, has a great version of Roads Must Roll from this series, from the Hall of Fame series, and a couple PKDs. In fact, but Exploring Tomorrow also did First Contact, and Exploring Tomorrow was the one that Campbell was involved with. And PKD's first attempt at writing in other media, he actually wrote an episode of Exploring Tomorrow for my dickheads out there. But I like the radio plays. They're pretty faithful until the endings. They changed the ending. There's no switch.
Ending?
Yeah, the endings is more nihilistic, with them like kind of blowing. I think they blow each other up at the end of the radio play, or they blow up the alien ship and they escape. That's what happens, and then they're like, "Hey, how could we avoid this next time?" kind of thing. And so obviously changes the tenor of the story a little bit, but it has Dort, it has the Crab Nebula, it has the Overdrive, it has all. I mean, it's very faithful for the most part. And I know people give me crap for, because I've said sometimes that because for me saying that Blade Runner has faithful moments, it's not a faithful adaptation of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, but it has faithful moments.
Can you say that about a marriage?
Yeah, right. You cannot. So right. And so in the same way, I think the First Contact radio plays has faithful ish moments, but and that's hard. Like I was, I was thinking about poor Paul Tremblay, who, for example, his Cabin at the End of the World got turned into a big Hollywood movie, and then with M. Night Shyamalan, and then he completely obliterated the third act of his novel. And so at the same time, I mean, he's like, happy I got my novel adapted and people are reading my novel, but it's not the same ending. And every interview Paul had to do was, justifying why he thought his ending was better, and it's a hard thing with adaptation, but in that regard, I think, I don't know. I think that's interesting. So, so I guess to kind of bring the Levana Von home here, like, what do we think about first, before we get into Leinster's, how he affects the canon now as a whole, but how do you guys think that First Contact affects the canon? Starting with Brian, rereading this, like what's your thoughts about how this comments on the canon
well, I think we have to think about how science fiction functions as a culture, and the fact that we say a First Contact story is partly because of what Leinster did with it, but also because what he was doing, and one of the reasons he could be so prolific was that the way science fiction writers were working at that time was to say, oh, here is a story that set this up. It's interesting. I think it might go this other way instead.
Right.
And that is so common that we've got these all these named varieties, which people have come up with different terms for. calling them motifs, calling them formulas. I don't think either of those works very well. And I tried to invent my own term, which has not been wildly successful, but Veronica Hollinger and I edited a book here, which I happen to have in front of me, called Parabolas of Science Fiction. I liked the word parabola, which turns out to be the same word as parable. And it, to me, that suggests the way a writer would take something from another writer and put a different conclusion and a different meaning on it on the same basic structure, which doesn't happen in formula fiction because they always have to end up in the same place with a marriage or a solving of a mystery. Science fiction has never worked that way. It's open-ended, but it's also interdependent, and the kind of unit of creativity is not the individual writer, the individual story, but the trope, the motif, whatever we want to call this thing. And so what I think Leinster was doing was responding to other stories in which there had been first contacts that ended up either with destruction or with, just an easy, no problem, we'll communicate, it'll be simple. You've got your friendly aliens like in Martian Odyssey, you've got your completely incomprehensibly hostile aliens. He's one of the few that tried to find a different path out of that basic situation.
And this is definitely a reaction to Arena. It's the same magazine. It's a year later.
And other writers responded to it. And I think we could spend a whole time not only talking about the Yefremov story that Stephen talked about, but also there's in this collection that Veronica and I edited, Rachel Haywood talked about Latin American science fiction and said that their basic setup for a lot of their fiction is not first contact, but second contact. Because first contact between alien civilizations had already happened, and that the Latin American writers tend to identify with the indigenous side, the colonized side. So it was always after that, you meet another alien.
Now, what was the story, Stephen, that you were talking about that that responded to this one? Because that was
that's interesting. I was going to say two things. One was that what interests me about this story is that it seems to be a response to, either the aliens are evil and they want to kill us, or else they're like gods and they want to enlighten us. And he's resisting both of those by making the aliens exactly the same as us. And the friendship between the two, between the main character and Buck, or I mean, it's sort of like they're exactly like every time they send people to the other ship who have explosive devices, which they're going to use, but the other people sent to their ship also have explosive devices. They're totally mirror image of each other. They have the same strategies and they have the same ideas completely, and that's what allows the resolution. So I thought that's interesting, as opposed to, I mean, if it's either saviors or evil, that's one way of trying to get a sense of, radical difference or something radically alien to us. But these are aliens are not really, they may breathe fluorine instead of oxygen, but they're basically the same as we are. And we each mirror each other, which is interesting.
And the Yefremov story is at the Heart of the Serpent.
Yes.
I think is the title.
Yes, I just read that. It's The Heart of the Serpent. So Ivan Yefremov, a Russian science fiction writer, this is I think published in 1958 initially and translated in English in 1961. But it's about...
Was that in Judith Merrill's collection of the Soviet science fiction? Or?
I don't know. I found it as translated by... It was translated... I mean, the translation was made in Moscow, not in the U.S. Okay. So it was officially released in English by the Soviets in a few years after it came out in Russian. But it's sort of like it's built into, I mean, I have no idea whether, Leinster was allowed to be read in the Soviet Union or how that came out. But I mean, again, there's this whole critique when they meet an alien civilization, the whole thing has to do with the fact that this is because of the benighted capitalist era, that they had competition, so they had to have this elaborate thing to prevent these from destroying each other. And so the Fremov story is explicitly criticizing the Leinster story as on ideological grounds. But it's also interesting. I mean, it's kind of, somebody pointed out to me on Facebook, this is sort of like a particular strand of dialectical materialism that was orthodox in the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s. And it's kind of like the universe is entirely rational, and if you follow these dialectical laws, then everything has to be the same. So of course the aliens have to be very similar to us. They have to have a similar human size and shape of humans, even though their differences, because this is the logical and inevitable way that things have to work out rationally in terms of the evolution of the universe. And that's the point of view from which they explicitly criticize Leinster's capitalist story of competition, since anybody advanced enough to have space flight to the Crab Nebula or wherever it is, I'm not sure but to far reaches of the galaxy would also have reached the stage of socialism where everything's socially perfect, and this would have to take a similar form no matter what planet and what the origin and what the biology was. So that's kind of interesting as a kind of, I mean, both the Leinster and the Efremov story cannot imagine an encounter which involves radical otherness from what we understand, but for totally different reasons.
Yeah. Can I bring in something we've not really talked very much about?
Please.
The gender exclusivity of the story.
Yes.
And the fact that the last sentence of it has to do with the human and the alien telling dirty jokes. And I found this quote from John Huntington, who did a wonderful book on the ideological work of the stories in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. He says this dirty joke: the gesture of comradely union is also a gesture of male exclusivity. Sexual difference is pointedly acknowledged as the racial gulf is bridged. Dirty jokes, while a mode of bonding, are also a mode of sexual assault, a form by which men, often rivals, collaborate against women. And I think that that's something that readers, if they picked it up at the time in 1945, and there were women readers and women writers of letters to these science fiction magazines, they probably identified with the masculine culture. The women, even the women who were reading the magazines. And it's not until a little bit later that you get writers like Eleanor Arneson writing another variation on this first contact potential disaster situation. Her novel Ring of Swords is basically another variation on this same basic setup with another way of avoiding conflict. But she acknowledges it's a wonderful book, and she acknowledges the kind of gender issues at work in it.
Well, that sounds great. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, I didn't really think about it much when I was reading it but the gender differences is pretty stark, and certainly if you were updating it, you would add women characters on the ship for sure. But yeah, and I think it's interesting because we're about to get the second woman in the Hall of Fame coming up, the second and only two women, Judith Merrill and C.L. Moore, with co-writing with her husband, are the only women that made the Hall of Fame, which is pretty big crime, in retrospect. That thankfully Lisa Yazek has done some good to help undo with The Future is Female and different Sisters of Tomorrow and stuff like that, which has done a really good job of recovering the writing that the women were doing in that era. But yeah, I thank you, Brian, for bringing that in. I think you're absolutely right. So as far as Stephen, did you want to comment on, well, maybe we should get into, starting with Stephen, like what we think Murray Leinster's, you know, I was kind of kidding about the Stephen King thing about him having the biggest impact on 20th century literature, but you know, he is so important to the canon, right?
Well, I mean, again, I haven't read as much of him as maybe I'd like to, but yeah, he seems to always come up with interesting ideas. And to the extent, as Brian was talking about before, that it's not the characters, but the ideas that make science fiction move. He's very interested in playing with scientifically derived ideas and seeing what he can do with them. And even, you know, so, and I don't know whether you should relate this to being the, I mean, is he systematically anti-apocalyptic is something I'd like to know, which I'd have to read more of his books for, but in the sense that it seems very, I mean, as we've already said partly, this story seems very different from a kind of triumphalism, which you often find in, you know, like in Heinlein and things like that of, you know, we have to defeat these evil aliens and stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting because I haven't read enough to know like what his major themes are or what he's doing, but you know, I know he's important. He's like one of these authors, like Edmund Hamilton is an example of somebody who's kind of lost to time, right? Like he was very important in his time, but you know, you know, Edmund Hamilton is starting to become, you know, Lee Brackett's husband, you know. And you know, I personally I've read a little bit of Hamilton, but I've read a lot of Lee Brackett. So, you know, am I to blame for that partially? That I, you know, I don't know, but Murray Leinster is one that I have a few more titles on the shelf here, and eventually I do feel like I need to get to them, especially the Forgotten Planet stories, which I know are supposed to be some of his best work. So, and I have that over on the shelf that I picked up last time I was in Ojai at the wonderful Bart's Books. So shout out to Bart's Books if you're ever in Ojai. It's a fantastic bookstore. It's partially outside and great. On that note, any closing final thoughts on Leinster or First Contact, starting with Brian, and then I want to get some general comments on the things you guys are working on after that. So
yeah, I guess just one comment is that there was a place for these journeyman writers who were not the masters, and Leinster was never named as one of the big three or singled out as one of the most important writers, never escaped from the kind of pulp world the way Ray Bradbury did. But again, I want to think about the way science fiction worked as a community and a culture, and that these individual stories and individual writers are part of something bigger. And so a theme like the First Contact story would not have come about without a number of people like Leinster working along similar lines, calling each other to task, correcting each other, supplementing and praising each other. And that is kind of how science fiction developed.
And this, by the way, is the edition that I have of the Forgotten Planet, the Masters of Science Fiction. And I think these stories are all set on its colonization of an alien world, and these stories were written from the 20s to 53 from what I can tell. So interesting stuff. But yeah, I agree that conversation, Brian, that's what I think, you know, those of us who study like the history of science fiction, that conversation between the writers is so important. And you're right, the work that Leinster did adds to the work that, you know, on down the line, whatever science fiction writer you're talking about years later, whether they knew his name or not, he was a part of that conversation. Stephen, final thoughts?
Well, I mean, it has to do, just what we were just talking about, it has to do with the fact that science fiction was still fairly marginal at this time. It didn't enter really mainstream American pop culture until the 1970s with Star Wars, obviously, and Star Trek jumping from a failed TV show to a series of movies. And so I don't know, it's Leinster isn't this weird, but something else, but there's another thing I thought about, so this maybe seem random, but Hal Clement, who's another interesting science fiction writer in this older tradition, and who was very concerned, was a scientist who's very concerned with scientific accuracy, actually has a quote somewhere where he talks about it's like a game the science fiction writer plays with their readers of, you try to make it as plausible as possible, and then they try to poke holes in it, and then you try to rewrite it so that you get rid of the holes and things like that.
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, Clement was talking, about books like Mission of Gravity, where he has a planet with very high gravity, and so the beings in this planet are like kind of little I mean, they're intelligent beings, but they're like a few inches long and crawl on the ground because that's the only form that could develop in high gravity like that. And the other quote I think about that comes from later is from something which we get from Alice Shelton, i.e. James Tiptree, which is, or should I say the verse, but anyway, which is, she has some writing somewhere about science fiction is this kind of mad cathedral, and she compares it to medieval cathedrals where all these different artisans put together parts, and the result is this kind of sprawling mega structure, which you can barely understand that it holds up, but it does. I can't remember the exact one, but something like that. So, I mean, that's how I tend to see. I mean, I spend more time on more contemporary science fiction, but I'm interested, like both of you, in the history of science fiction. That's how I tend to see those things sort of fitting together.
Yeah. And I thank you guys for a really great discussion on First Contact. Starting with Brian, what are you currently working on? And, what do you want to send people to, my listeners who are geeky enough to make it this far?
Well, in the last few years, I've been working more on fantasy than science fiction, and trying to find what is the kind of cognitive value of fantasy, because science fiction always claims cognition as its own territory and excludes fantasy. But I think there is a way we think through fantasy. And what I've been working on for several years is the relationship between dreaming and fantastic narratives. So that's a long project that's going to be a while yet.
Nice. That sounds great. Stephen, what are you working on these days?
Well, I first say that the book I mentioned earlier, Fluid Futures, which came out last summer, is it's longer than any other book I ever wrote, and it's kind of summary of, I tried to put together everything I was trying to think about in terms of science fiction in that book. So that's, at this point, it means I'm resting on my laurels, but that one of my current projects, which hopefully, I mean, there's a completed manuscript, I have to get it, is about a very interesting movie called Neptune Frost from 2022. Neptune Frost it's actually a science fiction musical, as unusual as that sounds. It's co-directed by Saul Williams, who's an American performance artist, rapper, and poet, and his wife Anicia Uzemen, who's a filmmaker from Rwanda in Central Africa. And the film was shot entirely in Rwanda with local cast and crew. But it's sort of about, it's about coltan mining. Coltan is a mineral which is mostly mined in Central Africa, which is then sent to the West to be used to extract tantalum from it, which is necessary. Tantalum capacitors are necessary to every electronic device we use today, or computational device. And then when the devices break down, they send them back to Africa to be disposed of. But they really lose. So there are these coltan mines, and there are also these junkyards of all this dead stuff. So that's one theme. The other theme is sort of about gender, and one of the main characters starts out as a man and turns into a woman, and it's about so it's a very odd film, which is both about gender nonconformity and I mean, it relates also not in Rwanda, but in some countries in East Africa, for instance, they've passed anti-gay laws, which are actually have nothing to do with African tradition, but are inspired by American evangelicals who've gone to these countries like Uganda. And so it's weird. I mean, there's a lot of social background, but it's also a kind of science fiction story um, about coltan mining and about one of the main able to disrupt the World Wide Web and the internet and send subversive messages to it and things like that. I mean, but it's also a political. So it's a political film, but it's a science fiction film, and it's also a musical because
Yeah, I've read great things about
Yeah.
Neptune
Where,
Frost.
where is that accessible?
it's streaming on most platforms. Like you get it from Netflix or Apple or whatever as streaming. So it's not an inaccessible film, though it never became famous because obviously it's marginal.
You can rent it for $3 from
Right.
Amazon.
for $3.99 or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or actually bought it on Amazon for like $12.99, which means I could play it when I was writing the book. It was very helpful. I could play segments whenever. So that's one project. My other project, which is more vague, is just trying to think about various issues which we're facing today in society and technology and how science fiction might help us to think about them. But I'm keeping that deliberately vague because it is vague. But anyway, okay, that's what I'm doing.
All right. Well, folks, coming up here on this podcast. So I have one other announcement I want to make towards the end about things that are going on. First off, we'll be covering Judith Merrill next, Only a Mother. I've got some plans for the guests on that, but I'm not going to talk about them until I get them confirmed. But I've got some Merrill experts that I want to call on. But something that's going on in this community right soon in the future is right now, every Tuesday night, we have a hangout for all the PKD scholars where we hang out on Zoom and we get really nitty gritty talking about like this letter and that letter. And it's for serious dickheads only, but we are going to be trying to open up that circle a little bit and be doing guests in the future. So actually, Stephen, I bet we'd love to have you back. We'd love to have you on there to talk about Neptune Frost at some point. And Brian, I'm sure talking about Le Guin at some point because they graduated in the same high school class together. But starting in March, we're going to be trying to do programming of guests and people where for the first hour, it's open to the public and anybody can come and get that content. And if you're nerd enough to stay for the second hour where we break down all like, he wrote this short story on this day and this happened on that day, you can stay for the second hour, which is that stuff. But right now we're mostly doing that stuff because as I am currently writing all the Wikipedia entries for the short stories, I am knee deep in that stuff. I am on volume 3 of the short stories writing the encyclopedia entries, so it's pretty serious work. But on that note, look for in the future the Dick Hangouts, the PKD Hangouts on Tuesday nights, 6:00 Pacific time. We are mostly in California, so look for those. We're going to be having all kinds of really fun stuff, but you got to show up to that live. And we will be recording some of the interviews for the Dickheads podcast, but in order to ask questions and be a part of the community, you have to show up live. So those will be expanding, coming in February or March. So keep your eye out for that on Tuesday nights. So yeah, that's coming up in the near future. Gents, you were awesome. And I'm definitely going to have you back for other episodes of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. I'm sure if you had fun and you enjoyed doing this, I'd love to have you back. Brian, where can folks find you if they want to find you or find your work?
Well, they can look for volumes of the Library of America's Le Guin editions. Several are out, more are in the works. They can also Google me even though I'm retired, I'm still on the Idaho State University website. I'm also one of the series editors for Perspectives on Fantasy from Bloomington Academic Books.
Nice. Stephen, where can
Well,
folks find you?
I have a blog, but it's not very active. I maybe write on it once or twice a year, but I can mention it's called the Pinocchio Theory, and you can search for that and find it. Aside from that, I don't know. I mean, I'm hopefully.
I will say on Facebook, you're a good follow for movie recommendations, and sometimes just commentary on movies I've already seen. But
Well, I was a film studies professor primarily, not a science fiction studies professor, and I've published several books on music videos, actually.
interesting. Yes, I have seen some of those out there, and they are definitely on my list. And the Fluid Futures, I'm definitely gonna get my hands on.
That's where I really tried to put everything together, to the extent
Yeah. Yeah, I think my listeners will dig that. And Brian, I already have the book you edited with Le Guin on my shelf, so I have more to get as well. But great.
It's kind of the anti-Hall of Fame.
Well,
we could get into that in more detail.
Which was funny. I believe it was Patrick Sharp who when I said you were coming on, he was like, I think he was the one that said that you were the anti-science fiction Hall of Fame person because working with Gwen. But yeah, and I think what you guys were doing was a little bit of a reaction to the to this list, right? I mean, to a degree. So yeah, and which is great. Early on in here, I found myself like Leinster's not one that I know, but with like CL Moore, like I spent a lot of time like, well, what story do I think would better represent her in this Hall of Fame? Or and same with John W. Campbell. I almost feel like Who Goes There is a better representation than Twilight, but who am I to say? But that's just one of the things we do here. So on that note, folks, then we'll be back in episode 11 for Judith Merrill for this series, and thanks for joining us. I'm not sure what's the next postcards after this one. I banked a whole bunch of episodes. I am thinking about trying to put together an episode talking about Jack London's Iron Heel and Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. Which one nailed this era of politics better? I don't know, but they both are pretty frightening representations of what we're living through today. So on that note, maybe look for that. Thanks for joining us, and
Thanks for
as
having
always
me.
on Postcards from a Dying World, support my guests by going out and getting their work, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.